When I was at university, the JCR, the Junior Common Room, elected every year a president from among its numbers to represent the student body to the governing body. And there was always more than one candidate, so we had elections, and before the elections, we had hustings, where the candidates would come and they'd set out their policies, and where we'd ask them a bunch of questions. Well, one chap, a particularly single-minded scientist, as will become evident, stepped up on the platform and he set out his policies. He said he wanted to streamline the Junior Common Room Council. Well, I thought that sounded like quite a good idea. He said he wanted to get rid of some of the bureaucracy. A good idea, we thought. And he said he wanted to do that by removing some of the extraneous representatives on the council. He said the council had got too large and unwieldy. He'd begin, he said, by introducing a representative for minority issues. Great, we thought. It's important that minorities are represented on the council. He said he'd do this by conflating the positions of disability rep and LGBT rep. Cue gasps and biting of knuckles around the room. Needless to say, the poor chap wasn't elected. He came in with very good intentions, but with no political acumen. He couldn't see past his context of efficiency. And it was the most striking example for me of the way in which a room can very suddenly turn against a person. We'd been absolutely with him in his intention, and when he came to explain how he was going to deliver that, the room turned very sharply. There's a bit how I feel when I come to reading the first lesson from Timothy today. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. Absolutely, I can get fully on board with that. First of all, most important of all, prayer. Prayer is to hold the preeminent, the central place in our worshipping meetings when Christians gather together. And the author to Timothy writes of 4 types of prayer. He says supplications. It's got a lovely meaning, that the word in the Greek. It means to kind of draw alongside somebody as you'd be walking together, or it means to come up to somebody in order to have an intimate word with them, to be able to have a quiet word in their ear. Supplications, to be able to draw alongside God, to have a quiet word with God. It's a kind of prayer that means praying for something that you lack, something that you're deprived of, something that you're without. It's the sort of thing that a farmer might pray for rain for their crops. And then there's prayers that we're told to make, a generalized word concerning all kinds of prayers, confessions, adoration, and so on. And intercession, those prayers that we make on behalf of others, praying for those who are sick, praying for those whom we love but can't help ourselves, and giving of thanks. Those are the prayers of praise. They're the ones that perhaps we most often forget in our prayer lives. How often do we come to the Lord simply to say thank you, simply to celebrate the goodness of creation, the great bounty that we've each been provided in our lives, not to ask for anything for ourselves or even anyone else, but simply to give thanks. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. Absolutely, I'm all on board. And then pray for those with power so that you might have an easy life. For kings and all who are in high positions, so that we might lead a quiet and peaceable life. And suddenly I'm really, really unsure. It sounds so alien, that line, when the overriding biblical call is to protest, to demands for change in the pursuit of justice. Far from the easy life, the scriptures almost always call us into challenging living. They call us to speak out, to stand up, to be counted on the side of the poor and the downtrodden against the powers and the principalities. It sounds so strange, juxtaposed with this prayer for all. It's not that I'm against praying for kings and those who are in high positions. I recognize that they need just as much prayer as everybody else. But if we're doing so in order that we might have it a little bit more easily, that seems completely the wrong reason. You know, I can think of loads of examples of saints who broke the law, who disobeyed authority. And in fact, I can think of examples from Jesus' own life, his healing of those who were injured on the Sabbath, his dining with tax collectors and prostitutes that outraged the authorities. But I can't think of many saints, many who've been praised in our tradition for taking care of the powerful so that they could have a quiet life. Now, this idea of respect for power and authority is against, I suppose, a kind of distrust of power and authority, is a generational and a cultural phenomenon. For example, if you look at sociological studies of the Western wartime generation and the Western millennial generation, you'll find that the wartime generation shows much greater deference to those in authority and much more respect of powerful institutions, whereas millennials have been taught to be suspicious of accumulated power and to distrust institutions. And it's a cultural phenomenon too. When we were over in Kenya a couple of years ago, Kenya had only a few years back licensed women into ministry as priests. And we asked those that we met, are there some priests here in Kenya who still dispute this? We said, you know, in England, we have a broad church where there are some people who are accepting and positively affirming of the ministry of women, and there are some people in some places that still are not affirming. They said, no. We said, but there must have been priests who 20 years ago were not affirming of women's ministry, and they've all changed their minds. And they explained to us what had happened. The bishops of the whole nation had gathered together and gone away on a conference. They looked at the scriptures again. They'd come back to their congregations. They told their priests, we've looked at the scriptures again, and we see no reason for women to not be in ministry. And the priests had all changed their minds, like that, overnight. They'd told their congregations, and they'd all changed their minds too. Much greater expectations about deference to authority in a kind of chain of command. So it's a thing that is dependent upon our context, our culture, our generation. And for the author of 1 Timothy, he's stuck in a bit of a bind, because he's a member of a society that respects human authority, that does show deference to power and to institutions. But he's also found himself as part of a faith movement that commends the poor and the downtrodden as the greatest, and it calls the important people and the rich people the least and the last. And even though he knew what Christ had done in turning upside down those human institutions and the expectations of the world, and even though he is able to write, there is one God. There is also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus himself human, who gave himself a ransom for all. Even though he can write this inclusive language, he can't quite make the next step within his context to realize that if God created all, and if he wishes to redeem all, then there is equality amongst all. It's easy for us to see from the outside, but it's so difficult to see when you're within that context. Just like my friend who was running to be the president of the Common Room, who started with the right idea, that we should have somebody to represent the interests of minority groups. Likewise, the author of Timothy starts with the right idea, that there is one God who is Lord over all, who desires everyone to be saved. But the author just can't quite see beyond his hierarchical expectations and his context. And he concludes from this that other relationships should be ordered in the same way that the relationship between God and humanity is ordered. He makes mini-gods out of kings and those in high positions, whom the people should look up to and should pray for in order to have quiet and peaceful lives. And if you read on later in this chapter, you'll find that he proposes the same structure within family life. He makes mini-gods out of husbands, whom their wives should serve. We're right, I think, to be wary of appeasing and acquiescing to power simply to live easy lives. We're right to condemn the hierarchical vision of women and men that we find in the second chapter of Timothy. But we'd be mistaken if in our smugness we just stopped there and thought, well, isn't it great that we can now see beyond the area, the edges of that context, and that we don't act like that. There's a much harder next step for us to take, which is to remind ourselves that we too are blinded by our context. That we do and say some things which reflect God's grace, and we do and we say some things which are opposed to it. And seeing the latter is so much more difficult, isn't it, than seeing the former. It's easy to see the ways in which we stand alongside God, that we reflect his grace. It's difficult to be self-critical and see the ways in which we stand against it. And perhaps if the first letter of Timothy can teach and help us to do something, it's to ask, what are those moments, what are those things that we do or we say that cause those outside who are looking on to gasp and to bite their knuckles? Perhaps 1 Timothy allows us to hold a mirror up to ourselves, to ask, where are we doing and saying things that are not glorifying God, that are not in line with his grace? How can we change our behavior, our lives, to be more reflective of his glory? Amen.